the title of this talk is a little bit ironic because there is so much content in this talk. I could probably give a 20-minute talk on each slide. So I'll try to keep it pretty high level. With that being said, if you do have any questions, please reach out in Discord, in the Antisyphon Discord. I'm just Graham Helton, or on Twitter or LinkedIn, or wherever. I'm pretty much in all those places. So to get this started, just a little bit about who I am. I think the thing that I do in my free time that I think is the most fun to me is I write a bunch of blogs on grahamhelton.com. That's mostly where all of my kind of scratch pad of information goes, right? If I want to kind of understand what I'm thinking about something, I'll write it down. And if I think that information will be useful to someone else, then I'll go ahead and post it there. My day job is I'm a red team specialist. I'm at Google. And of course, I have to caveat this with all the ideas in here are my own. But what I do there is basically building red teams and doing Linux and infrastructure type pen testing. Although, as we'll talk about here in a little bit, there's a lot more security engineering work that goes into this role. I have some qualifications. Other than that, if you want to reach out to me, like I said, pretty much everywhere, and you can find all those links at just grahamhelton.com/links. So the kind of thesis of this talk came to me when I was reading this book called Essentialism: The Disciplined Pursuit of Less. And there was a line in this book that kind of stuck with me. And the line was, or the quote was, working hard is important, but more effort does not necessarily yield more results. Less but better does. And so I was reading through this book and that just kind of stuck with me and I couldn't figure out why. And typically when something sticks with me like that, I'll try to apply it to different things. And in this case, I applied it to kind of what I do in my 9-to-5 job, which is, red teaming things. Basically, the thesis of this talk is how can you apply this idea of less but better, right? Working less hard, but giving more results out of that work. How can you apply that to red teaming or offensive security or pen testing or whatever you want to call it, which we'll actually talk about here in a little bit. So the big thing that this comes down to is choosing the right problems to spend your time on is probably the most important decision you can make each day. We'll talk a little bit about some of the complexities that we encounter whenever we are doing our day job, right? And so the big challenge that I've seen recently is that things are getting really, really complicated really, really quickly. And so basically what I mean by this is a long time ago, you might have just been able to get away with learning, Windows pen testing, have a little bit of Linux knowledge, and then maybe some web app stuff in there. And that's like you'd be pretty set for most environments. Nowadays, there is a lot more stuff that you have to deal with, whether that's cloud, whether that's doing things like Kubernetes. All of that stuff is much more complicated, and that causes a few issues for red teams. So the first issue that this causes is it increases the need for your red team to have people who specialize in different things, right? If you're on a red team and your main specialty is bypassing, whatever AV products there are, that's super, super important. But to have someone on staff who specializes in each of these kind of subdomains of red teaming or pen testing can get super, super expensive. The next thing that this kind of complexity makes difficult for red teams is the increased amount of R&D time that you need for kind of learning these technologies, making tools that interact with these technologies, or just researching these technologies so you can bypass them. And once again, the problem comes down to money. If you're spending time researching, some new technology, you're not billing clients. You're basically a cost center at that point, which can be, difficult in like a consulting style workplace to justify your existence if you just cost a bunch of money. The next thing is once you get into very, very, very complex environments, the issues that you're going to find, you kind of have to have institutional knowledge of how that environment is set up and what the what's actually going on, right? So if you were to come in as a consultant into a very, very complicated environment, you might have to spend a month just learning how the environment works. That's a very, very difficult thing to do because you can't just immediately come in and say, oh, here's, 50 findings. Therefore, like this is beneficial. And so when I say environments are getting more complex, like what exactly do I mean by that? First of all, things like Active Directory, obviously they're always getting more and more features. But what I'm really talking about is things like Kubernetes, CI/CD pipelines, infrastructure as code. There's all these different shifts in how businesses are kind of deploying their technologies. And each of those kind of subsets of technology kind of requires you to learn a totally different thing to be able to properly secure it. My big thing recently has been learning how Kubernetes works. And, luckily I've been given the time to go and research that. But if I were, just doing consultant style pen testing, and I spoke to someone and they said, oh, yeah, next week you're doing a Kubernetes pen test, I would have no idea where to start, at least a couple months ago. But luckily, I've been given the R&D time to go and figure that kind of stuff out. The next kind of complexity I see pretty often is, these massive environments are often shared among teams and owned by different teams, which can make it difficult to assess the security of them because one team might be aware that, hey, we're getting a security assessment, let's help them along. And then the other team might, not be aware of that and say, oh yeah, we're just going to restart a bunch of things in the environment, or we're going to push changes to the environment, or we're going to, patch a bunch of things, or, kick out the red teamers because we don't know that there's a red team going on. So one of the more unique examples of complexity that I wanted to talk about, because I don't see it talked about very often, is kind of like air-gapped environments. And when I say air-gapped, just think non-internet connected. There's really no such thing as a true air gap because there's always going to be some way for you to go to take stuff in and out of the environment, whether that's intentional or not. So when testing an air-gapped environment, it's one of those complexities that the first time you are doing it, it's kind of overwhelming because it breaks every kind of assumption that you have about, what you're supposed to do. Every kind of pen test I've done before doing testing on air-gapped environments has relied on having internet connectivity. And so just a few high-level things of what I've learned. Borrow from your DevOps friends. How are they getting code in the environment? How are they operating in the environment? What tools do they have in the environment? All that's super, super helpful. The next is get as much information as you possibly can about the environment before you actually go in, right? So do they have tools like Python? Is there any sort of compilers within the environment? What kind of tech stack are they using in the environment? And the reason you want to learn all this beforehand is as you are researching it, you can kind of tailor your methodology towards those tech stacks, and you don't have to learn kind of on the job when you don't have internet access. The next, like most cursed thing I will probably ever say is have a good printer workflow. If you're working in an environment that doesn't have internet access, having a template set up to where you can just, paste stuff into it and it will handle the formatting, the font size will be readable once you print it. That's something that will save you a ton of time. If you have too expensive printer or something like that. Very quickly, I want to talk about declarative deployments using something like Docker or NixOS. Again, all these slides are available in the Discord channel. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because, again, I don't have nearly as much time as I probably should for this. But using something like Docker to basically containerize your applications so that they are ready to go as soon as they're deployed is super, super useful. So what I mean by this is if you are running a tool, such as in this example, I'm running Certify. When you first install Certify, it's a Python tool. It doesn't have all the libraries that it needs to run. It has to pull those from somewhere. And typically, this isn't something you think about unless you don't have internet access. And Certify can't install the dependencies it needs because it can't, reach up and pull them down from the internet. So installing any tooling that you need inside of a Docker container and then transferring that Docker container inside of the environment, however you choose to do so, is super, super, super useful. And so kind of pulling on that knowledge that these DevOps people have had for, a pretty long time. So the commands that I am showcasing in these images, you can find them at this link on my GitHub. I'll probably be posting a pretty long blog post on this soon, but basically being able to containerize your applications is super, super useful when testing air-gapped environments. The next thing that I want to talk about is NixOS. NixOS is kind of like Kubernetes for just your operating system, right? So you declare in a single file, basically how you want your entire system configured. So you add your public key, you add the users that you want, you add the host names, the name servers, the time zone, if you want, what groups you want, any packages you want, and then any Nix machine that you deploy that configuration file to will be exactly the same. And so that means whenever you do bring in this machine to a air-gapped environment or something like that, you will have the exact same operating environment that you're used to. And finally, if you've ever worked in these environments, sometimes they will say, okay, I need a list of literally every single tool that you're bringing in, sometimes called a software bill of materials or an SBOM. This, you kind of get that for free because you're basically listing out in a configuration file every single tool that you want. And then they might say, hey, we want you to do a Kubernetes assessment. Why are you bringing in web app pen testing tools? With NixOS, you can literally just say, okay, fair. I'm going to go in my configuration file, remove the section that says, here is the web app pen testing tools. It's not recompiling, but redeploying that configuration file, and then your system won't have those web app pen testing tools. Another tip I have for quickly learning these new tech stacks is talk to the engineers who are working in these complex environments. They're the ones who built it, and literally just sending them a message on Teams or whatever and say, hey, do you have 15 minutes to walk me through like the most important thing about this environment is super, super useful. And most people are super happy to talk about it. That being said, they also probably know where like the security holes are, right? And they'll probably be happy to tell you because they've probably been trying to get them fixed for a while. And you can use your kind of pen test or a red team report and say, use that as leverage to actually get those holes fixed. The next tip I have is ask for the documentation that they provide to new developers for the project. That is something that they probably already have. If they don't, that's probably something, worth looking into. But if they might not think to give you as a pen tester or a red teamer the documentation that they give to their software engineers, but that can be super, super useful to you. The next thing is start with a threat model, right? So don't look at it as, I need to do an assessment on this environment. Look at it as I need to do an assessment on this, and then next week I need to do an assessment on this portion, and so on. I always like to say books are an underutilized resource. The first instinct I have when learning a new technology is to go and do what everyone does and just Google how to hack whatever. And this never crossed my mind until about a year ago, where I was like, why don't I just read a book that goes over, how I'm supposed to deploy this? And just the reading through that and deploying things myself is a super, super good way to learn it, but it's also a super good way to figure out where people might take shortcuts. So in summary, the problem of the increasing technological complexity is modern problems require modern solutions, and modern solutions require R&D time. So if that's not something you get, I would I would really bring that up as like a almost like a critical finding in your own organization, right? Especially if you're doing these complex tests. The next is leveraging the community. There's tons and tons of great blog posts and YouTube videos and super technical deep dives on stuff, and those resources are super helpful. And if you need more of a reason to kind of do this, these kind of talks or blogs, go check out my ironically blog post that I wrote for the last talk I gave with Antisyphon about the certification industrial complex and how you can kind of prove your competence in something without necessarily paying much money for it. And so the big thing about, you know, fixing this kind of increased complexity is solve the high level process problems before the technical ones. What process, if implemented, would make the current problem that you're facing right now just not exist? That thinking higher level and figuring out those problems will make your job so much easier, and you'll be able to produce like way higher quality work. So the next problem I have is that red teaming isn't particularly useful. This is coming from a red teamer, right? So red teaming is mostly useless for most organizations in most scenarios most of the time. And I say that as someone who does red teaming basically 40 hours a week. There's kind of like an ego thing when it comes to red teaming, right? It's seen as more of I guess, a more senior role to something like pen testing or maybe even like security engineering. But not only does no one really understand what it means, but calling your assessments a red team when they should be called something else can both confuse and frustrate your clients. And it's most of the time it's hugely overkill. So instead of calling everything a red teaming, think of things as a security evaluation or do a tabletop exercise or an architecture review. And I understand that this isn't, the typical, oh, I want a red team assessment. I want, your best, red teamer who's the most elite, hacker ever to exist. But being able to offer these other kind of services as a red teamer is kind of more advanced than just doing the stealthy, I'm not going to get, caught. I'm going to emulate, APT 123 or whatever. I would say that a lot of these are actually more difficult because you have to have more context of the environment that you're working in, and you have to, work directly with people. So you actually have to talk to people. It's actually kind of terrifying. So some ways that you can get kind of around this is um, be involved with the scoping process, right? If someone just says to you, hey, next week you're working on a assessment, and you ask, okay, what's the assessment? And they say a red team. Okay, great, but like, is that actually what the customer needs, or do they just not know what they want? Or you don't really get that context if you're not involved at all with the scoping process. It also helps you set expectations up front. If you're working with a client and they say, yeah, I want a red team because I've never had, a security assessment before, it might be nice to gently nudge them away from that because it's not going to be useful for them. And then the other thing is build relationships with clients. The big thing with this is you want to be kind of seen as a trusted advisor, which I'll talk about shortly, but you don't just want to come in as a consultant and, send a few emails and just kind of like own their environment, right? What you really should be trying to do if you're actually trying to increase, a company's security is you want to build that relationship so that they can ask you, hey, I've been, super worried about this VPN gateway that we have exposed to the internet. Is there anything that I should be concerned about? They're not going to ask you those questions if your only communication with them is emailing them saying, here's this thing you messed up on, and it's going to make you look really bad, and I'm going to tell your CEO about it. So with that being said, becoming a trusted advisor is, I don't know, I feel like this is a buzzword, trusted advisor, but basically what you're trying to do is get to the point where you're talking with a client and you're consulting for them, but you're also answering the questions that they don't already know that they have, right? So the ideal circumstance is you commit to a client for as long as possible for it to actually help them. That's kind of hard to do in a typical consulting role, but if you have any power to basically alter how your company does consulting, having a more long-term approach can be super, super useful. The other interesting thing is providing more than just a PDF or a Word doc at the end of your engagement can also be super useful and can make your findings more actionable. So one thing that's super interesting is basically like a GitHub issues style tracker of the findings that you have. And so this is something I've been thinking about for a while, but basically going through and listing each finding as, hey, here's a critical finding. Here's, all the details. Here's the recommended remediation plan. And now you can actually assign that ticket to someone and then watch as it, as it goes through and actually gets fixed. It makes it much more easy to fix things than just, sending them a PDF with, 500 pages. So finally, like thinking more as like a security engineer and less as a elite hacker, red teamer who's going to pwn an environment is definitely what I've been trying to shift more towards. And it has been super, super useful. Again, this can be difficult if you're in kind of a traditional consulting model where you're going to customer environments and you're expected to provide these red team services. So it might be useful to kind of talk to the people who are in your leadership to say,
clearly we lost Graham. He must have dropped. And yeah, there's plenty of emojis happening now. So we'll give Graham a couple minutes here, maybe come back on, and say bye to y'all, of course. I could listen to him talk like all day though. He's such a great guy.
Yeah, I'm definitely been while he was talking. Yeah, this is the first time I've actually been introduced to Graham and just taking a look at some of the stuff he's done. He's definitely, I guess, forgive me for saying a titan in the industry or whatever. He definitely knows his stuff, and it's definitely got a lot of certifications behind him. So he's one to listen to in the space, that's for sure.
Yeah, I see him screaming in the Discord chat right now. I met Graham a couple of years ago because he had a fishing course that he did a couple of years ago, and it was really good. So he's been around for a while and definitely giving back and teaching and sharing his knowledge, and I greatly appreciate that. I know y'all really appreciate that as well.
Oh, I see Graham in the backstage.
Oh, welcome back, sir. Good to have you
back.
back.
Yeah, there's a little red teaming going on the internet here.
You were kind of, I think, ending things up. Is there anything else that you want to kind of add to that, or was there additional info that you didn't cover there that you want
to? No, I actually made it to the last slide when my internet cut out. At least on my end, that's what I saw. But if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Is there a reference of pen testing tools and security engineering tools for free that you can share? Probably have some stuff on your website, don't you?
It's hard because there's so many different things that go into security engineering. Honestly, what I do is I find someone who is like specializing in that area of security, and then I'll message them. There's lots of different, compilations of tools and techniques and stuff. Security in general, I think that probably have to be like a little bit more specific. But feel free to DM me. I can point you in the right direction.
How do you think AI is going to affect things, Graham?
It depends. I think for security, it will make things for the people who are already kind of doing security assessments. I think learning how to use AI is helpful, right? So for example, for me, I use it to write PowerShell because I hate PowerShell, and the only time I ever need to write PowerShell is like a quick one-liner.
We can't be friends anymore. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Bash, I write the bash. I don't let AI write my bash scripts. But doing stuff like that, or just doing like tedious tasks. One example is if you have ever written Kubernetes manifests from scratch, it's not fun. So getting kind of like a template and then altering it on your own is super, super helpful.
I've always liked PowerShell, especially since you can get it on, it's the same language on multiple OSs. I kind of stuck on that one.
See, I try to avoid Windows as much as possible. So I have very little PowerShell experience.
All good, sir.
If I avoided Windows, I'll just shut down my business.
Fair.
Right. If anyone else has any other questions for Graham, you guys can reach out to him, grahamhelton.com. He's also on the Discord server as well. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Graham, for sharing your knowledge with us today. Always appreciated. And I would love to have you back. I'm sure others would love to have you back as well. So we'll be reaching out to you.
No problem. Hopefully next time I'll have a better internet.
Yeah, you are all good, sir. Everybody, I hope you all have a great day, and we'll see you in the next session.
Thanks, everyone.